Well, good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I am delighted to welcome you to this conversation with Susan Rice, former United States Ambassador to the United Nations, National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama, and now the author of an acclaimed memoir, the New York Times bestseller, Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. Since this is an introduction of Ambassador Rice, I will begin naturally by speaking about myself. I began working as a speechwriter in the White House of President Bill Clinton in October of 1994. I'd been a reporter in Europe covering German unification and the beginnings of the post-Cold War world, and I thought that being hired by the White House had confirmed, had truly ratified my sense of myself as a young man on the move, someone who was truly going places. And I got to the White House, where I traded in the great independence of a foreign correspondent to be the smallest cog in the most merciless bureaucracy, that of the federal government. And I experienced a kind of reevaluation that went with the daily humiliation of speechwriting. You might even say I had a come down. I began to watch people who were really talented, energetic, motivated, bright, and extraordinarily capable. When I look back on that group, some of them became top diplomats, generals, admirals, some now write for Hollywood. That's really exalted. Others are in Congress, and others still run companies. None of them had more energy, more verve, more blazing smarts or spunk than Susan Rice, who was not even 30 and was one of the real standouts in the bunch. Susan, in short, was a phenomenon. The standard description of Susan Rice's early years in the policy world would be that she had a meteoric rise, although that phrase, when you think about it, really doesn't do her justice, because meteors fall, they don't rise, and Susan was rising very fast. A graduate of Stanford with a doctorate in international relations from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, Susan came to the NSC after a stint at the consulting firm McKinsey. She started out in 1993 as a director at the NSC. That's the entry-level job. There aren't very many levels there. For international organizations and peacekeeping. That was the portfolio she had. 2 years later, she was made a senior director for Africa, a job with really enormous responsibilities. Just 2 years after that, in 1997, while pregnant with her first child, she became Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, which put her in charge of 43 ambassadors. And I met one of them recently, and he described them as pale, male, and Yale, as well as all their embassies and the several thousand foreign service officers and civil servants who worked in the field or in Washington on African affairs. And I should note that Susan was the youngest assistant secretary for a regional bureau, a matter that annoyed Richard Holbrooke to no end. And by the way, in case you're interested, I was still writing speeches at that point. Unusually, Susan remained in that job at the State Department for more than 2 years. She stayed till the end of the administration, in which she had become a star. During the Bush 43 years, she became a leading member of the so-called Democratic Government in Exile, while working as a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She was really one of the core members of the Democratic policy establishment, but I have to say she was equally well known for throwing some of the best parties in Washington. In 2007, Susan began advising a young senator, a recently elected African American with an extraordinary political gift, a remarkable ability to inspire, and a funny name. The rest is history. When Barack Obama was elected president, Susan Rice helped run his transition and was, in one of his first appointments, made ambassador to the United Nations, in which she was confirmed to that job by the US Senate. She served with great distinction in that cabinet post for more than 4 years. And when the recently re-elected Obama with whom she had a remarkably close and productive relationship, asked her to be his national security advisor. She accepted, and she served in that position until January 20th of 2017. To translate that into the modern vernacular, that means that she served for the equivalent of Michael Flynn, H.R. McMaster, John Bolton, Robert O'Brien, and 3 players to be named later. Leaving the White House gave Susan an opportunity that I know she was eager for, namely to be reunited with her family, because somehow in those crowded years she'd managed to build and maintain a marriage to a really terrific guy named Ian Cameron. And that is a big achievement given the jobs that she has held. And she also co-raised 2 great children, a daughter who is in high school, who we need to attract up here, and a son who is at Stanford. She's also continued to play an outsized role in our public life. Today, Susan Rice is Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow at American University, a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, and she serves on a variety of boards, including that of the U.S. Fund for UNICEF. In her writings and on television and in public engagements, she has been a powerful and wholly undaunted voice in a very difficult time for the same values she upheld in office: American leadership, human dignity, democracy, and the rule of law, to name just a few. Susan has been one of the people who has really shaped our times. I am personally inspired by her example, by her passion, her intelligence, and her incredible dedication. I'm really proud to call her a friend. And I should add that I am enormously grateful that she persevered in getting here today because, as you might have imagined, travel delays kept her about 4 hours on the runway in Washington, but she persevered nonetheless. And in fact, I think that we can readapt that great saying of the last few years. She persisted, and she got here. Please welcome Susan Rice.
Hi, everybody. How you doing?
I think they've heard of you.
Dan, that was long but really sweet.
Yeah, that was why I was still writing speeches when you were assistant secretary, too. First of all, it's a great book. I know many of you have it already, but I highly recommend it. It is an important work, not only because of the insights into Susan's life, but I think it's also an important text about how government works, on all the different things that are going on, and just how hard and good a lot of our civil servants are, foreign service officers, and a lot of the political appointees. So I really do recommend it. And congratulations on it.
Thank you from your best-selling self. I just want to say how glad I am to be at Dartmouth. Dan, thank you so much for bringing me here. Thank you for your friendship and for being such an amazing colleague and for all of your contributions.
Oh, well, thank you.
Oh, really?
Thank you. Okay, so as Senator Warren might say, let's dig in now. So I want to read you a quote from Tough Love that really irked me.
Only one?
I just said one. On our way back from Stanford, my plane got diverted. This is Susan, age 17, perhaps 18. Because of an April snowstorm in the east, I had to spend a night on a frigid floor in the Omaha airport. And I wondered all night, how am I going to forgive myself if I choose to go to New England and freeze my ass off from November through April? What kind of attitude is that?
Look, I was just speaking the truth. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and that's where I still live, and that's as cold as I ever want to be. And the older I get, the more averse to being cold I get. And so Stanford, I mean, no offense to any of these wonderful New England colleges and universities, but I just got a text from my husband today, who's out at Stanford visiting our son. It's Parents' Weekend coming up. And he sent me a photograph of him in his shorts and a t-shirt. He'd just run to the Stanford Oval, which is itself a gorgeous, beautiful backdrop. And his message was, it's 75 degrees. And he was saying to my daughter, who's a high school junior, basically needling her that this is where she ought to go. And it's the last place she wants to go. She may well come freeze her butt off, but that was not for me.
If you had wanted students in t-shirts and shorts, we could have arranged it. Because there's an extraordinary number of Dartmouth students who on days in the high 30s actually are wearing t-shirts.
Well, that's impressive.
Yeah.
Because one of the most important things I learned at Stanford was how to develop the discipline that you can only get when you are looking at extraordinarily beautiful, muscled men throwing a Frisbee while you're trying to study. So if you have that here, that's definitely
we have that in abundance.
A point in your favor.
We have it in abundance. And in fact, I myself will throw that Frisbee. Okay.
No.
So, all right, my Frisbee days are past. Okay. So, I am kind of curious. What impelled you to write a memoir now? You are very young. I know I don't feel very young, and you're only a little younger than I am, but you are very young. And when I think of policy officials writing their memoirs, I think of, Dean Acheson writing President at the Creation when he was 76. Now, winning a Pulitzer Prize at 76 is not bad, but what was it that, what was the prod here that made you want to do it? And particularly, what made you want to write a hybrid book that was very much about family as well as about the policy experience you've had?
Well, I think the question of why now is really the right question, because I think at some stage I was planning to write a book, sharing my experiences in government and two administrations, dealing with some of the issues we'd wrestled with, but also my upbringing, my early years, because I think, have learned some things from my family background, from my childhood, and from my service that I hope would be of use to people who are trying to compete and thrive in unforgiving environments, and when they've gotten knocked down to get back up. So that was my core motivation. But the timing, frankly, was driven by the fact that, as some of you will recall, in 2012, I went on 5 Sunday shows as UN ambassador, and up till that point, a relatively low-profile member of President Obama's cabinet, and I described, among other things, what we knew about what had happened in the terrorist attack in Benghazi that killed 4 Americans, including our ambassador. And following that, as within about a week to 10 days, as more information came out, some of what I had reported turned out to be in error. And I was in the heart of this election campaign, immediately vilified as a liar, somebody who was not very bright, to quote John McCain, and many other things. And suddenly I'd gone from relative anonymity to becoming a villain or a victim or a heroine or whatever it was, depending on what cable channel you watched. And obviously none of that represents who I am. And I couldn't, though, because I was still representing the United States, speaking for the president, speak for myself and put in my own words who I am and what motivates me and where I came from. And so I felt like for the remaining 4 years of the administration that I was obliged, happily by virtue of taking the responsibility on, to not speak for myself and to not be able to tell my own story in my own voice. And so when I came out, quite honestly, I felt an urgency to do that before I might have at, say, 70 or 75. And it wasn't just that I hadn't been able to speak for myself, but that I anticipated that somebody might try to write something that tried to characterize me for me yet again. Mm-hmm. And so that's why now. And in the process of doing it, I thought it was very important. If I'm going to try to tell the story of who I am and what I've learned and what shaped me, I had to be honest. And I had to be sometimes painfully honest. And that involved talking about family and, my kids and my husband and my parents and their bitter divorce, which very much shaped me. Because without that, I wasn't able to tell the truth about who I am.
Right. Well, I have to say that in my reading of the book, the part that I really would have liked to see another 200 pages on was the part about family.
And my editor didn't want to see another 200 pages on it. No.
Well, that may be because I lived through a lot of the other stuff with you. But no, it's really an extraordinary family story. And, on your mother's side, you come from Jamaican immigrants, including a grandfather who was a cobbler, who was badly injured, who worked as a janitor, and still put all of his, four sons through Bowdoin and a daughter, your mother, through Radcliffe, right? On the other side, and this is in Portland, Maine, of all places, where it also gets cold there.
So I know of what I speak.
That was the secret reason you didn't run for the Senate there, right? Isn't that it? You don't have to answer that now. And on your father's side, descendant of slaves, and all these extraordinary figures, Tuskegee Airmen, your father who became, governor of the Federal Reserve. And so there's this amazing mixture where you have this background of people who have really risen against so much adversity, and at the same time, you were raised, in the midst of the Washington elite. You went to school with the kids of senators and people who are now senators, to put it in shorthand. So I wouldn't try this at home in a lab, putting all these different ingredients together, but you tell me how that all came together. And as you mentioned, a pretty bitter divorce in the mix as well.
Well, there's a great deal about my family and my parents, and indeed even my grandparents, that was vital in shaping who I am. And that's why I spend a good portion of the first part of the book delving into that. The short version, or the summary version, it's not that short, is that on both sides of my family, coming from very different perspectives and backgrounds, immigrants on one side, descendants of slaves on the other, the common theme was education and service. On my father's side, my father was born in segregated South Carolina in 1920, in the heart of Jim Crow and at the height of lynching. But remarkably, he was the grandson of a slave who, after emancipation in South Carolina, joined the Union Army and fought on the Union side in the Civil War. And after the war ended, he met, during the war, he met an officer who was one of his commanders from Massachusetts, a white man, who said, if you come up to Massachusetts, I'll help you get a primary education. And that's what happened, and he went back to South Carolina after he got his primary education. He was a school teacher during Reconstruction, but he was driven out of the South by the Klan, and he fled to New Jersey. Once he got to New Jersey, he realized that there was an opportunity for him to get his divinity degree at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. And so this former slave became a college-educated man, and he decided to devote himself to creating a school for African Americans in New Jersey that would teach them both vocational and technical skills, but also college preparatory skills. And so this school my great-grandfather founded in the late 1880s, called the Bordentown School, lasted some 70 years into the mid-1950s, educating generations of African Americans and bringing to campus people like Albert Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune. So this commitment to education and commitment to service and trying to lift oneself and others up was very much ingrained on my father's side. And my dad came along, and his father had been to college, and the expectation was that he would go to college, and yet it came at a time when it was really quite challenging. He did end up going to college. He then was drafted during World War II and served at Tuskegee with the Tuskegee Airmen. He wasn't a pilot. He ran an office on statistical control. And when he left, he wanted to get his PhD in economics and found his way to the West Coast, to Berkeley, and got his PhD in economics, finished in 1955, but couldn't get a job anywhere on the West Coast, in the private sector, in government, or anything else because he was black. And he finally got his first break. He got a job as an assistant professor at Cornell, but only because they didn't know he was black until he showed up. And his professors at Berkeley had helped sort of sneak him under the radar, and to Cornell's credit, they didn't put him out. And that began my father's rise in his field. He went to the Treasury Department, to the World Bank, and ultimately to the Federal Reserve. But he struggled with race and prejudice in ways that were really profound. And he developed a philosophy that he shared with me and my brother that was so impactful, which was he recognized at some stage early to the middle part of his career that if he assumed all of the psychological burden of other people's racism, it was going to weigh him down. It was going to keep him from being who he could be. And he realized that bigotry is, to a large extent, a function of other people's insecurity. And that even as he faced all these barriers, he had a choice about how he thought about himself. He developed the mental muscles to build his self-esteem and withstand the debilitating prejudice of others. And so he developed a saying, which he shared with me and my brother many times, which is, if my being black is going to be a problem, it's going to be a problem for somebody else, not for me. And that's how he fortified himself, and that's what he brought as he ascended throughout his career. My mom, as the last of 5 children, daughter of a janitor and a maid with no education, immigrants who came to this country from Jamaica, and as Dan said, went to Portland, Maine in 1912, they were some pretty scrappy, upwardly mobile, hardworking immigrants like so many in this country. And they saved and scraped, and they did send all 5 of their kids to college. And my mom, the youngest, who had been valedictorian of her high school class in Portland, Maine, and a champion debater and a school president, almost didn't get to go to Radcliffe even after she got in because her father, my grandfather, the janitor, had had a catastrophic accident at the music store where he worked. He fell down an elevator shaft, and he shattered his back and he shattered his legs, and he was in the hospital for many, many months. And all their savings were tapped. And the state of Maine's Radcliffe Scholarship Committee refused to give my mother the scholarship that she was entitled to as valedictorian because she was black. And the explanation they gave was that the recipient of the scholarship was supposed to be able to come back to Maine and move in the proper circles to raise money for Radcliffe. And because she was black, by definition, at that time, this is 1950, she wasn't going to move in the proper circles. So she ended up, her high school principal and her debate coach went to bat for her directly to Radcliffe, got the money. She was able to go. She was magna cum laude, like you, Dan, at Harvard, and president of her whole student body as one of 3 African Americans in her class. And so she had this also passion for access to higher education, and she made her life work broadening the ability of Americans who are low income from all different backgrounds to reach college. My mom was known as the mother of the Pell Grant. She worked very hard to get that program established and sustained, and that program has enabled 80 million Americans to reach college. So that was her thing. Yeah. So service and education, and by the time I came along, my mom was working for a nonprofit at the College Board, my dad was in government, but they had enough that they were able to send me and my brother to some of the best private schools in Washington. And we did go to school with, the daughters and sons of senators and ambassadors, and amazingly, several of my classmates' parents went to jail for Watergate. I mean, we were in the thick of it.
That's a kind of diversity.
So I was steeped in all of that. And it gave me both an interest in government, and a perspective on, how government could function and bipartisanship. Some of my very closest friends were the kids of Republicans, and therefore themselves Republicans. And that was normal. And then, so all of that was part of the brew. And then just to add one last point, as great as my parents each were, they had no business being married to each other. And so basically from the time I was 7 to the time I was 15, I was in the middle as they went through a very violent and ugly last phase of their marriage, separation, divorce, and then prolonged custody battle over me and my brother. And that too was among the formative experiences that I write about.
I have to say, it's an incredible family story, and I do hope that it is, maybe when you would otherwise be writing President to Creation, you'll give this a longer treatment.
Maybe I should try to write something like that one day. I don't think
it's an amazing story. It really is. So let's move on a bit and talk about the early part of career. So as I mentioned, you were moving incredibly quickly. You also found that it wasn't as easy as it might have looked from the outside. And that, in fact, sometimes one needed to develop skills to deal with colleagues that, no one had really maybe told you about. As I say this, I remember a conversation you and I had once in the office of our mutual mentor, Richard Clark, who many of you will remember from the 9/11 hearings. And at that point, Sudan was a big issue. And Dick sort of put me up to testing out whether you would agree to reopen an embassy in Sudan, because we really wanted to have people on the ground knowing what was coming. And you looked at me, and if I could translate the look, it would say something like, "One more word out of you, Benjamin, and you will have one lung." But I was not the person, who's going to give you trouble. So why don't you tell me about the lessons? I think somewhere in here there's a future NSC senior director or an assistant secretary or maybe even a national security advisor. So what would you tell that person about dealing with other people, dealing with colleagues? I mean, suddenly you had an enormous management issue with all those male pale Yale ambassadors.
So the job that Dan described when I was Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and the youngest regional assistant secretary, I started that job at 32. And I just had our first child. So I was also a breastfeeding mom in a small C conservative culture of the State Department. And of course, an African-American woman on top of that. And I think it's fair to say that many of my senior colleagues, particularly many who had reached the level of ambassador, were more than skeptical that I was properly placed in that job. And even though I'd worked the issues for several years prior at the White House, I had a close working relationship with the other parts of the interagency that I had to coordinate from the White House, and a relationship with the President and the Secretary of State. I was young. I had never served in the field and worked my way up the ranks as they had for 25 or 30 years, and never served at that point as an ambassador. And so the level of skepticism was extremely high. And my approach was somewhat informed by what my father taught me, that I couldn't allow other people's perceptions of me or belief that I didn't belong become my own viewpoint, because then by definition I would I too would think I didn't belong and I'd fail before I started. So I sort of tuned all that out. And my approach, even as we were dealing with wars breaking out all over the continent, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Congo, Sierra Leone, and the bombings of our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania by Al-Qaeda, my approach was just to drive forward and be goal-oriented and as determined as possible to push people forward. And I realized early, about a year into the job, that leadership style was absolutely going to fail at the State Department. And the only reason I realized it, as I write about in the book, is I had a colleague who was actually a former congressman, a man named Howard Wolpe, who was an extraordinary man, who was serving at that time in the State Department with me, but as President Clinton's special envoy for Central Africa. He wasn't a career person. And he took me out to lunch one day, right before Christmas, and about a year into the job, and he said, "Susan, you're smart, you're driven, you've got great policy ideas, but you're gonna screw this job up royally if you don't change course. You're too impatient, you're too hard charging. You don't bring in the perspectives and the views of those around you. You're discounting the wisdom and the experience of all of these people, and they're not gonna work with you effectively. But if you change your leadership style, I think you can succeed." And it was the greatest gift of tough love that I've received from somebody who wasn't one of my parents. He told me the hard truths I needed to hear. And what I learned from that, which is the answer to your question, Dan, is that leadership is not an individual sport, it's a team sport. And effective leadership requires investing people and in empowering people and making them feel that they all have a part to play in contributing to the success of the enterprise. And as a result of that very hard advice from Howard Wolpe, I was able, I think, to improve my leadership style, to be more collaborative, to be more patient, to recognize that sometimes the fastest way from point A to point Z is not in a straight line, that you have to sometimes tack and weave to bring other people on board and to sustain their support. So learning that patience, learning that collaborative leadership style, and recognizing that sometimes the fastest way is not the most sustainable way. Those were among the most important lessons I learned early that thankfully I had before I had to serve in more senior roles.
So thank you for that. But one of, you spoke before about your fateful morning on all the Sunday shows. And I want to get to that. And so you've been in the thick of things, not only the policy world, but also where policy, bleeds into politics and sometimes leaves its practitioners bleeding as well. And, you were really, in some ways, kind of the unwittingly and unwillingly the poster child for polarization. And I am curious, having been through that crucible, what you think about our polarization, and how, if you think that there's a way back, if you have any ideas for how we can we've always been a vigorous country with lots of fighting going on, but it really does seem pretty dire now. And as you say, rightly, the greatest threat to our national security is our domestic political division. So what are Susan Rice's hopes for overcoming this?
There's a lot in that question, Dan.
You can pick, you're an experienced diplomat. You can pick and choose.
Well, I look back on, my experience in 2012, 8 years ago, and it looks like patty cake compared to where we are today. And even though it sure didn't feel like it at the time. In some ways, what happened to me was a leading indicator of where we were going. Truth didn't matter, facts didn't matter. We went after individuals in very ad hominem ways for political purposes. And I think we've seen that escalate and accelerate to a place that's even very much different from back then. I have a lot to say about our domestic political divisions, and I write about them in the last chapter of the book, which I call Bridging the Divide. And I talk about, as Dan said, that my strong conviction that our domestic political divisions are our greatest national security vulnerability. They are enabling us to be weakened and exploited by enemies like the Russians every day on social media, who are playing actively and aggressively on both sides of every divisive issue, aiming to pit Americans against each other. But they're playing on a division that we created, and they're manipulating it and exacerbating it, whether guns or race or immigration or gay rights, you name it. Their whole enterprise is to cause us to fear and hate each other, and to doubt the legitimacy of our institutions, of information, of facts, and of our democracy. And so I think that's very real and very serious, and I try to offer a range of thoughts, ranging from, how we educate our kids, to how we can reform our political system, to how we consume our media, to signal ways that we could begin to minimize the power of the extremes and reinforce a rational middle. And I do think that that's achievable, but it's not going to be easy. And I think we have to both gain some hope and strength from history, and at the same time have a real sense of urgency. I mean, if you think back on our past, we've had periods of much greater domestic political division than we have today. Go back to the Civil War. Go back to Reconstruction and the backlash to Reconstruction. 2 world wars and then McCarthyism. Vietnam and the civil rights era, where people like me were facing fire hoses and dogs, and kids were getting shot on college campuses. Watergate and beyond. And we've come out of these periods whole, and arguably over time stronger. And so we have the capacity to address and heal our divisions if we have a sense of purpose and urgency, and if we recognize that at the end of the day we have so much more in common than we have that divides us. And I also write in the book about how in my very own personal life, in my family, we're living with these divisions. Dan mentioned my kids. I've got a very progressive daughter who's a high school junior, and a very conservative son who's a college senior, and a former leading campus conservative and president of Stanford College Republicans. And it's not like a phase. He really, this is for real. And they're both really bright, really good kids that we love deeply. But, it's hard. And dinner discussions can get way out of control. And so the bottom line is we have to, just as I have no intention of letting these divisions rip my family apart, we have to have that same kind of conviction about our country. And yes, we need some leadership that is willing to put the interests of country and national unity over political gain. And I'm not here to pretend that that is on the horizon in Washington. And what we've seen in the wake, I guess not in the wake, in the context of impeachment, where one branch, the Congress, and one party has decided that they really absolutely don't have any interest in upholding their co-equal responsibilities in terms of seeking information, testimony, holding the executive branch accountable. We are at a precarious moment. And we will see much more that makes Benghazi look like patty cake before I think it's over. But I do think we have the capacity to arrest this trend and to take back our unity from those who want to divide us.
You know, I was thinking about your son and his political leanings, and you know, in most families you blame it on the other parent, but your husband's Canadian.
Well, he became an American just about the time Jake started going off the reservation.
Oh, okay. All right. Truth can be told.
But, and there was this period of 4.5 years when I was mostly in New York, and Ian and the kids were in Washington. So,
knows what was happening
no,
at
I
dinner.
don't blame anybody except maybe myself. To the extent that, you know, my husband and I'm proud of this, I'm joking about blaming myself. My husband and I really have tried to raise our kids to have the courage of their convictions and to be confident in their views and to have the courage to get in the arena. And they both do. And I'm very proud of that. And, you know, sometimes you get what you ask for and you got to live with it.
So the clock is ticking down, and I only have about 20 questions left.
I can't tell by this clock, by the way. It's just giving us the time on the...
That's the time, yeah.
All right. It's not
I think
a
so.
countdown
I mean, it looks
clock.
like the time. So look, 5.5 years ago, when you were National Security Advisor, you were confronted with a really worrisome problem, and that was an epidemic in Africa that threatened to become a global panic. Well, deja vu all over again. That pathogen was Ebola, and you got the US military to deploy to Africa and do some of the really vital work to stem the tide of that epidemic. Now, after that experience, I am guessing that you're following the preparations that are going on for dealing with the coronavirus. And I'm sure that, like me, you are really pleased that Vice President Pence has been put in charge. I am not partisan at all. Vice President Pence, of course, believes in conversion therapy, believes smoking doesn't cause cancer, and doesn't believe in climate science. But I don't want to pile on here. So what should we be doing right now? Susan, can you help us out here?
Well, there's, again, a lot in that, but
You keep saying that.
let me tell you a few things that characterize our response to the Ebola epidemic that I think have relevance today. And then I want to actually remind you all of another experience that most people have forgotten that I think is actually more analogous to today than even Ebola. So when the administration got the indication, the facts from the CDC, and the director of the CDC literally came flying into the White House Situation Room to a meeting that I was chairing with the National Security Council principals. And he sort of breathlessly dropped a chart in front of all of us, and it was a hockey stick, you know, flat and then spiking. And the chart was a depiction of the CDC's estimates of how many people would become infected with the Ebola virus by December if we did not change the trajectory. This is early September. And basically the chart estimated that 1 million people in West Africa, over 1 million, would be infected. Now, Ebola has a mortality rate of 50 to 75%. So just imagine the consequences, not only in human terms, but in economic terms, and, you know, given global travel and all of that. And we decided with a great deal of urgency, led by President Obama, that we had to do everything we possibly could to stem that epidemic. And the president agreed to deploy the US military, 3,000 personnel. We'd never, ever before or since deployed the military to help deal with the disease. And what they did was not go treat it, but build the infrastructure and the capacity so that civilians could be leading the treatment efforts. We rallied the entire world, and got countries from China to Canada to Germany to contribute personnel and equipment and all kinds of support to the effort. 10,000 healthcare workers from Africa came to the region with our support to tackle the epidemic. And long story short, and very importantly, we didn't panic, we didn't shut the borders, we didn't allow the alarmist rhetoric coming out of Congress or people on Twitter like some guy named Donald Trump to drive our response. President Obama insisted that science drive our response and that we weren't going to hype it, but we weren't going to underplay it. We were going to call it straight. And at the end of the day, there were 28,000 infections and 11,700 deaths, which is still, an enormous loss. But when you consider what it could have been, it's rightly considered in retrospect a success. But the one thing I want to remind people of that I think everybody almost has forgotten, the last real pandemic we had was in 2009. This was the swine flu pandemic. And it hit us 4 months into the administration when we just started. We literally didn't have yet a Secretary of Health and Human Services confirmed. She was confirmed, Kathleen Sebelius, on the day the president first convened his cabinet. But the reason we don't know about it, even though 60 million Americans got the swine flu, over 12,000 died from it. And it went all over the globe, and globally, the hundreds of thousands died, is because actually the response to it, given its potential scale, was highly effective. And the panic was contained. And leadership was provided by the administration, by the president, by the CDC and HHS. That is more akin to what we could be facing today. And we're instead seeing, underplaying, overplaying, people like, Mike Pence, who, it's good to have somebody based in the White House coordinating the response, but it needs to be somebody who knows what they're doing. And, Dan pointed out to me as we were coming in here, a story in the New York Times, that all of the senior leadership of CDC, of NIH, all the experts in the government have now effectively been told that they cannot say anything publicly unless and until it's been cleared by Pence. The one person that enables me to sleep well through this experience is a man named Tony Fauci. Hope you guys have seen him on TV. He is one of the smartest, most dedicated, most experienced people ever to serve in the US government. He is like a gift from God. And he's taken us through all kinds of these things for over 20 years. And now he's being told he can't speak publicly without his words being approved by Pence. That's what's scary. We can handle the health consequences of this if we're well organized. Economic consequences, I think, are going to be quite significant. But not if we can't tell the truth.
So I want to ask you one real down-the-middle foreign policy question, then we'll turn to a few questions from the audience, which thankfully have already been submitted, and that is, and we've touched on this before, Russia, has probably violated our sovereignty with its meddling in our elections and forthcoming meddling as well, more directly than anything since 9/11 and maybe since Pearl Harbor. And yet Russia is a country with an enormous nuclear arsenal. I mean, the old joke that it's Upper Volta with nuclear weapons has a certain amount of truth, but they also have an ability to play a spoiler role in many different parts of the world, which they're doing aggressively, particularly in the Middle East, where right now we're seeing just an unbelievable humanitarian catastrophe unfold in Syria. Assuming that the next president has a different kind of relationship with Russia than the current president, what should that relationship look like? What should our policy look like? How are we going to get get this relationship, on the right track?
Well, I think the unfortunate reality is that Russia under Putin is going to view everything that pertains to the relationship with the United States and our respective leadership roles in zero-sum terms. Putin is about bringing Russia back to its historic greatness in his view. And to do that, he has to weaken the United States and the West and the democratic model. And that's what he's doing. So in light of that reality, my view is that Putin is a classic bully. And bullies understand, strength. And I don't mean military strength. I mean, first of all, working effectively and in tight lockstep with our allies, rather than conveying the message that our commitment to NATO and to each of those NATO countries is questionable. It's about imposing very real and intensified economic consequences on Russia for its behavior, particularly with respect to its interference in our elections. We put on sanctions. We need to put on more sanctions. And yet we can't afford, and nor would it be wise, even as we punish and pressure them for what they're doing to us and to Europe, for us to cut off communications and refuse to engage diplomatically. There are things we need to deal with them on. We should be renewing the START Treaty, which will expire early next year. We should be able and willing, where our interests align, as they did, for example, in the Iran nuclear deal, to work with Russia towards common objectives. There are very few fora anymore where that engagement with the Russians happens on a daily basis. One of the few is the United Nations, and where, as much as we read about the areas where we disagree, like Syria and Ukraine, most every day we are getting something done in the United Nations, despite the difficult relationship with Russia. In spite of the difficult relationship with Russia. And so we have to find ways to both be strong and clear and wise to what they're doing, even as we don't sacrifice the opportunity to cooperate when that's in our interests.
Alliances matter.
Very much so.
Yeah. Okay, some questions from the audience. I know that lots of people probably are asking this one, so I will put it to you. Are you campaigning or favoring any of the Democratic candidates?
Because we're in New Hampshire, right? Yeah.
Where the primary is an eternal thing.
Did it say campaigning for or favoring? Is that how it was phrased?
It was campaigning, open paren, or favoring, close paren, any of the D candidates. I assume that was Democrat.
I assume. So the short answer is I haven't endorsed anybody. I have been helpful to those who've asked for my help, which I'd say about 4 or 5 of those that are either still in or were once in. And I haven't, by virtue of the fact that I live in the District of Columbia, where our primary, I think, is in early June, had to make a formal decision myself. But I'll tell you what I'm looking for and what I think we need. I think we need somebody who would bring a stark departure from Trump's temperament and policies, but with the ability to come in and really reset our relationships internationally. And somebody who can be a force of at least the ambition of unity, meaning that they can not only bring the disparate portions of the Democratic Party together, hopefully, but also attract independents and moderate Republicans. I worry about, narrow casting ourselves such that we can't build a broader base and risk the gains that were made in 2018 in the House and risk the prospect, however remote of taking back the Senate.
So as a follow-on, it's worth asking. We had Emily Haber, the German ambassador, here just a few weeks ago, and maybe she was being, to paraphrase the old saying, as an ambassador, an honest woman lying for her country, but she was very positive about the ability to get back to sort of where the transatlantic relationship was and the global community was, before 2016. How optimistic
in
are
the
you?
context of having a new Democratic administration?
Yeah.
How optimistic am I?
By the way, I've just outed her, and I really apologize. But she was saying the relationship was strong, and that there would be a snapback, to use a term that you coined in a different context.
I think we can and we must work to repair those relationships. And I think that, again, not without, favoring a particular candidate at this point, somebody like a Joe Biden brings a unique capacity to hit the ground running, to do that just because he has these relationships, and he's had them for 30, 40 years, and he's a known quantity. And so when Angela Merkel, looks at the Democratic field, that's the guy that she has the most knowledge and experience of, to use an example. But I don't think he's the only one that can do it. I think a number of our candidates could well take that task on, but I think we also have to be more clear-eyed about how much damage has been done. And the damage is not just, frankly, from the executive branch. The damage is, we have shown an inability to tell the truth. We have put these close relationships in jeopardy. We've elevated and praised adversaries and demagogues. And I think we've shaken the faith in many parts of the world that we can be that responsible global leader that they can count on, or at least predict. So, any rational foreign leader or foreign, citizen is going to wonder, if we've done this once, what keeps us from being able to do it again? Right. And worse still, everybody thought, well, okay, we may have a president who's, kind of testing the limits, but we've got checks and balances. We've got courts, we've got a Congress. Surely the Republican Party will do its job. So two branches have sort of shaken, at least so far, we're on a roll, but two branches have shaken the faith of our international partners.
Okay, so another question, and I'm going to preface this. Henry Kissinger was once asked if he'd ever had a principals committee meeting, or the highest level foreign policy meeting about Africa. And his response, the story's apocryphal, but I believe it. And he said, not on my watch, as though that was something he'd be proud of. Susan deserves enormous credit for putting Africa way higher up the American foreign policy agenda. And this question is about Africa. And it says, over the course of your career, the African continent has been a really important focus for you. However, while political interest in Africa and the U.S. has declined, China has dramatically increased investment there. And assuming political will wasn't a constraint, what would you recommend that the U.S. do to respond to Chinese engagement in Africa? Would U.S. counterinvestment be possible?
Well, that's a great question. I do worry. Let's assume we have leadership that understands the importance of Africa to us economically, strategically, in every other term, and wants to do the right thing. I do think it's a mistake to adopt a sort of Cold War framework in a new guise and view our relationship to Africa in terms of opposition to the Chinese or competition with the Chinese is real and as troubling as their omnipresence has become. So I don't think we can or should aim to compete with China in Africa or any other part of the world where their Belt and Road Initiative is prominent on their terms. Economically, I mean, Congress is never going to appropriate the kinds of hundreds of billions of dollars that the Chinese are sinking into infrastructure around the world. But the problem with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is not that they're building infrastructure. That's a good thing. We're not going to build high-speed rail in East Africa, and it's a good thing if East Africa has high-speed rail, which we had it. But the problem is the terms on which they're doing. They're doing it on exploitative terms. And that's also not something we would replicate. So I think the United States needs to invest in places like Africa in our mutual interest, but play to our comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage is in things like education and helping build capacity in civil society and in health and in agriculture and in helping young leaders develop and emerge, in supporting human rights and democracy and empowering women. These are things that we do well when we try to. And they're very important, and they're part of what has distinguished us and attracted other countries to our example and to our common effort. So we need to compete, but we need to compete on our terms.
So it is a little ironic, perhaps, to ask this question of someone who has, as I said before, been targeted for attack by political critics and the like. But maybe you have a better answer than the rest of us. And the question is, in tough times like this, when we're bombarded with negativities in politics, what can we still hold on to stay positive and believed? Thank you.
Well, as troubled as I am by the moment we're in, and I don't minimize the challenges we face. I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm still an optimist. And I'm an optimist for the reasons we've already discussed about understanding our history and what, the problems we face in our domestic divisions are a problem of our own creation. And therefore, a problem that we have the capacity to address and resolve. And there are a lot of problems that we don't have the capacity alone to address and resolve. So I take some comfort out of that. I also take comfort frankly, in our young people. When I look around and, scan the universe for people who are doing good despite all the obstacles in front of them, it's people like the kids in Parkland and, Greta, and so many young people who are just saying, we don't need to be constrained by all these forces telling us no. We're going to be fighting and committed to making concrete positive change. And that's, I see that in young people and, whatever their politics, that I find really encouraging. And I think, to a large extent, those of us our age need to start getting out of the way.
Really?
Yeah.
I find that somehow deeply unsettling. Well, anyway, I think that is a completely great note to end on. Many of you have copies of Susan's book, and I hope you've brought them with you. And the Norwich Bookstore will very shortly be up here, and Susan will be happy to sign copies once you purchase them. So we're going to hide out in the back for just a few minutes, and then we'll be right back and see you and your copies of the books.
I hope you all will stick around and I get a chance to meet you, and thank you all so much for being here.
And I hope you'll all join me in thanking Susan.